In the previous module, we looked at causes of human brain damage. In this module, we will focus on 4 diseases that are associated with brain damage. Epilepsy is primarily characterized by seizures. That's what we call epileptic seizures. Please note that not all people who suffer from seizures are considered to have epilepsy. The criteria to be diagnosed with epilepsy basically is repeatedly generating a lot of seizures because of chronic brain dysfunction. It's about 3.8% of the population that are diagnosed with epileptic at some point in their lives, but there are individuals who occasionally may get a seizure, and this can be brought about by high fever or some type of toxin that the individual was exposed to. Because the convulsions or the seizures are quite diverse, it is often difficult to diagnose epilepsy. There are individuals who have seizures in the form of convulsions. These are motor seizures, and these are the ones that typically bring about a lot of tremors and just kind of being rigid, or sometimes the loss of balance and consciousness. But a lot of seizures do not take this form. Some of them, in fact, involve more subtle changes of thought, mood, or some behavior that is easily distinguishable from other activities. So as we go through the process of understanding epilepsy, please note that it is not an easy diagnosis to be made. The causes of epilepsy, typically, and all the causes of brain damage, they have been described in this chapter. Viruses, neurotoxins, tumors, blows to the head, all of these can cause epilepsy. And also there's a lot of different genes that have been linked to epilepsy. In many cases, epilepsy seems to be associated with faults in synapses that are involved in inhibition. Because of these difficulties with diagnosis, the ability to diagnose really depends a lot on evidence from an EEG. The value of the output would basically be confirmed when there are a lot of bursts of high amplitude spikes. And by high amplitude, we're talking about large waves that would be seen in the measure of the activity in the brain. Sometimes before an epileptic attack or seizure occurs, individuals go through these psychological changes, and this is what is known as an epileptic aura. Sometimes they have a smell or hallucination or a feeling, and the aura's nature would suggest that the location of the epileptic focus would be occurring in an area that's consistent with what the aura is. In other words, if there is a hallucination, and that is a visual one, then it would imply that the seizure would be occurring closer to the occipital lobe. There are 2 general categories of seizures, and one of them is what is known as partial epilepsy, or also known as a focal seizure, and the other one's generalized epilepsy or generalized seizure. Please note that a focal seizure is one that does not involve the entire brain. That's why we look at it as a partial component. The epileptic neurons at the focus would begin to discharge together in bursts, having like a chain reaction, and it is through this kind of program bursting of neurons that would bring about a lot of the spikes that would be detected on the EEG. The symptoms that are associated with focal seizures basically depend on the part of the brain that was affected by the seizures. Because they do not involve the entire brain, they're usually not a complete loss of consciousness or equilibrium. In contrast to the partial epilepsy, generalized epilepsy would involve the entire brain, oftentimes bringing about a complete loss of consciousness and equilibrium. And it is important to note that sometimes generalized seizures begin as partial seizures, and so eventually they would just start gradually spreading throughout the entire brain. These sudden onset of these seizures and these generalized seizures often results from pathology that begins in a particular structure, sometimes the thalamus, and that would project to various parts of the brain. And we use the thalamus, as you know, that it is a relay station that would send information and output to different parts of the cerebral cortex. Parkinson's disease is a movement disorder that typically affects middle and old age people. Prior to 2014, it used to affect about 0.5% of the population. Now it's grown to 1% of the population. Please note that men are a little bit more affected than females are when it comes down to Parkinson's disease. The symptoms of Parkinson's are typically mild at the beginning, and starts off with a little bit of tightness and stiffness around the fingers, but eventually they begin to increase in severity. It begins to affect them more and more parts of their body as they begin to get older in age. The most common symptoms of the full-blown disorder, once it reaches a stage, are what's known as tremors. And these are often produced during inactivity, but not during voluntary movement or sleep. Interestingly, these individuals are able to sleep and engage in certain activities without this in here. It is only during kind of resting moments in there. Pain and depression also have often developed before the motor symptoms become more severe. And this is something that we believe has something to do with the debilitation of the individual, but also because of the degeneration of the brain and how it's affecting different parts of the central core and cerebral cortex. Similar to epilepsy, Parkinson's disease seems to have no single cause. Some of the culprits and people of interest have been faulty DNA, infections in the brain, strokes, tumors, traumatic brain injury, and other toxins that have been implied as responsible for Parkinson's disease. However, the majority of cases, there isn't a specific cause that would be obvious, and there is also no family history of the disorder. We find that a lot of the genes that have been linked to Parkinson's disease are not necessarily seen in individuals in previous generations. Parkinson's disease is associated with a degeneration of the brain across the board, but in a posthumous analysis of individuals who had Parkinson's disease, it is revealed that there is severe degeneration of substantia nigra. You may remember from chapter 3 that is part of the midbrain, and the neurons in there project through a pathway over to the basal ganglia. This is one of the major parts in movement that are not involved in the major pathway, but that do regulate and coordinate all the sensory modalities so we could generate a smooth movement. Substantia nigra is also a part of the brain that is known for its active role in releasing dopamine. And a lot of the neurons in substantia nigra do release dopamine in here. However, this is this is kind of evident with individuals who suffer from Parkinson's, because they would actually see that there is little to no dopamine that is released by the neurons in this particular part of the brain, substantia nigra. In fact, we've seen again through autopsies that there are clumps of proteins in a lot of the surviving neurons in the substantia nigra, and these are clumps that were basically brought about because of a degeneration of the brain. Because dopamine is involved in the movement and the tremors, we find that administering or providing injections of L-Dopa, which is a synthetic form of dopamine, we can alleviate temporarily Parkinson's symptoms, the tremors. However, please note that this is not a permanent solution. and it usually becomes less effective the more the individual continues using it. A more modern and yet controversial process or treatment to help individuals with Parkinson's disease would be to stimulate the brain deeply so that we could, with low intensity, apply to the specific part of the brain that would be bringing about the tremors, depending on part, because Parkinson's disease patients sometimes have tremors in the hands or in the legs or jaw. The treatment typically involves the electrical stimulation of a nucleus that would lie right beneath the thalamus. This would be connected over to the basal ganglia, and the frequency of the stimulation that would be employed would bring about a reduction of the function of the target structure, and so this current, when turned on, would alleviate the symptoms almost instantly. But the effectiveness of this deep brain stimulation begins to decline over a period of months. So this is not something that is permanent. It seems to be a little bit more longer lasting than L-DOPA, but we also know that and have confirmed the role of the basal ganglia on this inherited substantia nigra, because when the stimulation is stopped, we find that the symptoms would appear almost instantly again. Multiple sclerosis is a progressive autoimmune disorder that attacks the white matter, and specifically the myelin sheath in the CNS, which you may remember are the oligodendrocytes. These would bring about these hard scar tissue, and that's what sclerosis is. It's basically hardening of the brain. The nature and severity of the deficits would vary depending on the nature and size and position of the lesions that sclerosis brings about. And so depending on which part of the brain is affected, you would start seeing those deficits in our behavior or in our thinking process. The periods of remission are not unusual. Up to 2 years, individuals are able to go without any type of difficulties. However, the symptoms would appear thereafter. And some of the symptoms would include visual disturbances, weakness in the muscle, numbness or tingling in different parts of our limbs or our body, tremors, and also a loss of motor coordination. Please note that an autoimmune disorder is basically a disorder in which the body's immune system attacks part of the body as if it were to be something foreign. And multiple sclerosis, again, is an autoimmune disorder. Unfortunately, this typically attacks young people. Just as they're beginning their adult life in their early 20s, they would be affected by these terrible symptoms. Epidemiological studies, which is basically the study of various factors that would contribute to a particular disease in the general population, have revealed that there are some interesting features among individuals who suffer from multiple sclerosis. Interestingly, the age, gender, and race influence significantly on who gets multiple sclerosis. We find that the females are substantially higher, and they have a higher likelihood of suffering from multiple sclerosis than males do. And it's also a lot more prevalent in Caucasians individuals than any other ethnic groups. The ones that seem to have the lowest prevalence for MS are Africans and people of Asian background. We've also noted through correlational studies that individuals who lived in very cold climates, especially during their childhoods, are also at a greater likelihood from suffering from multiple sclerosis. Please note that these are correlational findings, and there is no cause and effect relationships with that in there. It is also important to note that the rate is only 25% of monozygotic twins compared to 5% of dizygotic twins. So although there is a higher prevalence for genetic predisposition, it is not that high considering monozygotic twins. And that is to say, if you have an identical twin and that individual has multiple sclerosis, there's only a 25% chance that the other twin will get that. When it comes down to dizygotic twins, which basically were two eggs and two sperm that were fertilized, they only have a 5% chance of suffering from MS. So the genetic predisposition is quite limited, and there is still a lot of uncertainty as to what is the cause of multiple sclerosis. Unfortunately, Alzheimer's disease is one of those diseases that the majority of people have heard of. This is a disease that's the most common cause of dementia in the elderly, and we find that this increases significantly as individuals age. Please note that Alzheimer's disease is progressive. It sometimes appears as early as 40 years of age, but the likelihood of developing this begins to increase as we get older. About 10% of people over the age of 65 suffer from this disease here, and we find that in its progression in the early stages, there would typically be a selective decline in memory, deficits in attention, and personality changes. These, if we are older in age, may not be very telling, as there would be other causes or other factors that could be contributing to that. In intermediate stages, we would see a more confusion, more irritability, anxiety, and also a deterioration of speech. Eventually, this begins to progress over to other parts of the brain that control vital functions, and so in the advanced stages, we would see individuals that would have difficulty engaging in some basic responses and behaviors such as swallowing or controlling the bladder, and eventually this can lead to death, as Alzheimer's disease is terminal. Please note that Alzheimer's disease is not the only cause of dementia. In fact, we cannot diagnose this with 100% certainty on just behavior alone. Diagnosis with complete certainty is actually only done in an autopsy. More recent research in 2013 and 15 revealed that CSF, cerebrospinal fluid, and brain imaging tests have also improved in our ability to detect earlier. And so the sensitivity of these tests and the technology is fusing with our understanding of this in here, and it has allowed for us to have a better idea of whether the individual is suffering from Alzheimer's disease before they die. The three most common characteristics of Alzheimer's disease are neurofibrillary tangles, which are basically thread-like tangles of protein in the neural cytoplasm, and we're talking about inside the cell. We also have amyloid plaques, which are clumps of scar tissue. These are basically composed of neurons that have degenerated, and they begin to form a protein that's called beta amyloid. This is present in normal brains, but with small amounts. With individuals who have Alzheimer's disease would have much larger amounts of beta amyloid and these amyloid plaques in their brain. More recently, individuals have begun exploring the role of neurovascular factors in Alzheimer's disease. And the reason why is because there have been recently some apparent dots that have been spotted throughout the brain. There seems to be more concentration in some parts of the brain more so than others. But these dots that appear here are lesions that are the result of these small hemorrhages. It's called microbleeds. And as a result of this in here, there have been recent studies that have focused on understanding how the blood flow and the vascular factors in the brain affect or influence Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease has a major genetic component. We find that people with Alzheimer's victim in their immediate family are twice as likely to be stricken by the disease if they survive to significantly old age. And we're talking about the 60s and older. There's also early attempts to identify the genes that are involved in Alzheimer's disease, but they have not been successful in the past. Recently, they've been focusing on the rare onset at an earlier stage of the disorder that would run with a few families. There's actually a family in Bolivia that has been studied significantly because of how this disorder seems to manifest itself earlier in these individuals. And we find that mutations to 3 different genes have been shown to contribute to the early onset. The 3 genes mutations seem to contribute only 1% of the common, and that would be the late onset form that we're most familiar with. These 3 genes, again, while they're seen in a family that has an early onset, would not necessarily generalize to the population at large. Currently, it is believed that there are about 15 genes that are associated with the late onset of Alzheimer's disease, and they've been focusing specifically on a gene that's in chromosome 19. This is what codes for the protein APO or ApoE, and that is a particular allele on this gene that has been shown to increase the susceptibility to the late onset form of Alzheimer's disease, and this by approximately 50% only. Now, the specific functions of the cells are not completely known, but we do know that the APO binds to beta amyloid, and that such binding would reduce beta amyloid clearance, and this would bring about an increase in beta amyloid aggregation, which would eventually lead to the development of these plaques that we mentioned earlier. Unfortunately, we do not have any cure for Alzheimer's disease, partly because the search for a treatment or a cure for Alzheimer's disease is not clear which symptom would be primary. We don't know if it is, again, the forgetfulness or various other components that would appear earlier on. For now, the amyloid production or the increase in amyloid would be a dominant symptom to focus on, because we would propose that because of the presence of amyloid, these plaques would be formed, and this would be our primary symptom to focus on. And if we focus on that, then it would take care of all other subsequent symptoms that this would bring about. Here you can appreciate a little microbleed that would have resulted from Alzheimer's, that would have been seen in an individual who has Alzheimer's disease. So here you can see this blue dot component, and this would have been magnified so that we could see the microbleed.